Section 1. Why everyone gets orcs wrong. There is a species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe that outnumbers every other intelligent race in the galaxy. A species so resilient that it is functionally impossible to eradicate from a planet once it has taken root. A species that operates as a self-sufficient, self-replicating war machine, one that carries its own food supply, its own engineers, its own doctors, its own priests, and its own weapons factories wherever it goes. And does all of this without any formal education, without any central government, and without ever really meaning to. A species that, if it could somehow be persuaded to work together for a single concentrated moment, would end every other civilization in the known universe before lunch. That species is the Orks, and almost everyone underestimates them. There is a very particular kind of dismissal that Orks get, both in the lore and in how people talk about them at the table, in YouTube comments, in forum threads. They are called the comedy faction, the joke army, the green tide of barely coherent savages who paint their vehicles red and believe it makes them go faster. People look at their ramshackle patchwork of welded scrap metal and shoddily bolted together firearms, and they laugh. They look at the orc players' fondness for mad cackling war bosses and grot bullying and weapons named things like the shock attack gun, and they file orcs somewhere in their mind between a cartoon and a footnote. This is a perfectly understandable response on the surface. The orcs present themselves as comedic. The humor is baked into every level of how they are written. The speech patterns, the names, the casual violence, the sheer exuberance with which they approach every problem, whether that problem is a political dispute, an engineering challenge, or an enemy space marine. And Games Workshop leans into this. The orc range has always had an element of dark comedy that distinguishes it from every other faction in the setting. But here is what that surface-level reading misses. The comedy is real, and the threat underneath it is also real. These are not mutually exclusive. The old ones did not build a species that would struggle with the existential weight of its own nature, the way humans and Eldari do. They built something that would fight forever with genuine enthusiasm, and the clearest expression of that enthusiasm, the thing that most makes it clear how completely optimized the orc psyche is for what it was designed to do, is the joy. They love this. They have always loved this. And a thing that loves what it does, that is biologically incapable of experiencing the burnout and despair that eventually grinds down every other faction in the setting, is more dangerous for that love than it would be without it. This script is about why that dismissal is one of the biggest mistakes you can make in understanding the 40K setting. Because beneath the noise and the crude armor and the deliberate comedy lies something that, when you sit with it long enough, becomes genuinely unsettling. The orcs are not simply a species that loves to fight. They are an ancient bioweapon that was engineered before recorded history by beings who understood the nature of war better than perhaps any intelligence the universe has ever produced. Their biology is not primitive, it is optimized. Their technology is not ramshackle, it is psychically sustained. Their culture is not chaotic, it is a pressure valve on a power source that, if it ever stopped venting, might crack the galaxy in half. Orcs are not the joke army. Orcs are the species every other faction is quietly terrified of. And today, we are going to understand exactly why. Section 2. Before the galaxy remembered, origins, the old ones, and the war in heaven. To understand where the orcs come from, you have to go back to a time so ancient that even the Eldari, a species that has existed for hundreds of millions of years, consider it deep prehistory. You have to go back to the war in heaven. In the earliest recorded epochs of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the galaxy was dominated by two colossal powers. The first were the Old Ones, beings of almost incomprehensible intelligence and psychic capability who had spent millions of years seeding the galaxy with life, cultivating younger races, and building the foundations of what they hoped would be a civilization that could endure forever. They were the architects. They were patient, methodical, and brilliant in ways that make modern concepts of intelligence seem quaint. The second power was the Necron Tyre, a species driven by bitter jealousy and a desperate desire to escape their own dying sun. After centuries of war and political maneuvering, the Necron tier entered a pact with ancient star entities known as the Chitin, the star gods, who fed on the energy of suns and offered the Necron tier the gift of immortality in exchange for something they did not fully understand the cost of at the time. That cost was their flesh, their life, their organic existence. The Necron tier became the Necrons, skeletal machines of living metal, stripped of almost everything that made them a people, but granted the undying bodies they had always craved. And then they went to war. The newly forged Necrons, guided by their chitin masters, attacked the old ones with a ferocity that shook the galaxy. The chitin could feed on the psychic energy of living creatures, and they consumed it with ravenous abandon. The old ones, for all their genius, found themselves in a fight for survival. It was in response to this existential threat that the old ones made one of their most consequential decisions. They were already creating species, psychically gifted, thinking races that could act as partners and collaborators in their grand project. They had made the Eldari. They had shaped other races, but now, with the Necrons and the chitin pressing against them from every direction, they needed something different. They didn't need more philosophers or diplomats or psychic mages. They needed soldiers. They needed an army. They needed a weapon so effective, so self-sustaining, so absolutely unstoppable in the context of pure warfare that it could hold the line against machine gods and their undying legions. The Orks were that weapon. This is the first thing that changes everything when you properly understand Ork lore. These creatures were not accidents of evolution. They did not crawl out of some primordial swamp and happen to discover violence. They were designed. Every single aspect of their biology, their psychology, their culture, and their society was deliberately engineered by beings who had spent millions of years mastering the art of shaping life itself. The old ones looked at the problem of war and created its perfect solution. The Orks were crafted alongside another race that served as their intellectual class, a group of beings known in ancient records as the Brain Boys. The current scholarly consensus within the Imperium's Adeptus Mechanicus and the wider xenological community is that these Brain Boys were likely not a separate Orkoid subspecies at all, but were in fact the Old Ones themselves, or perhaps a direct offshoot of them, serving as the guiding intelligence behind the Orkoid race. Before they disappeared, either through death, ascension, or simply departure from the material universe during the chaos of the war in heaven, the Brain Boys took one final, extraordinary precaution. They encoded everything the Orks would ever need to know directly into their genes. Not as cultural memory, not as written records that could be destroyed or lost, not as oral tradition that could be corrupted or forgotten. They wrote the knowledge directly into the biological code of every single Ork ever to be born. Technical knowledge, combat instinct, the Ork language, the fundamental understanding of how machinery works, how weapons function, how to repair a vehicle or construct a weapon from raw components. All of it baked into the genome at a level so deep that no amount of cultural degradation, isolation, or deliberate interference could remove it. Every Ork that has ever lived has been born knowing how to fight. Every mech boy that has ever picked up a wrench has done so with an instinctive understanding of mechanical principles that no human engineer could equal without decades of study. Every weird boy that has ever channeled the raw, psychic energy of his kind has done so because that channeling was built into him at birth. The Old Ones didn't just create a warrior species. They created a self-replicating, self-educating, self-sustaining weapon system and then released it into the galaxy. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The war in heaven did not go well for the Old Ones. The chitin were too powerful, the Necrons too relentless, and the Old Ones were eventually overwhelmed. But before they fell, they had made enough changes to the galaxy that their creations could continue without them. The Necrons, having destroyed their masters, went to sleep. A great sleep that would last for 60 million years. The chitin were eventually shattered by the very Necrons they had empowered, their essence broken into fragments. The galaxy was left scarred, ancient, and deeply, fundamentally changed. And across that changed galaxy, the Orks endured. They didn't need the Old Ones to guide them. They didn't need anyone to maintain them, or sustain them, or keep them going. They simply spread. Spore by spore, world by world, millennium by millennium, they colonized planet after planet without anyone organizing the effort, without any central command directing it, without any written plan ever existing. They simply did what the old ones had built them to do. They fought, they spread, they multiplied, and they waited, without knowing they were waiting, for the conflicts that would call them forward. The Aeldari rose. The early human civilizations rose. Other species came and went. Empires burned and were forgotten. And through all of it, through hundreds of millions of years of galactic history, the Orks were there, spread across countless worlds, fighting each other when nothing else was available, growing slowly stronger, growing slowly more numerous, the pressure of their numbers building behind a dam that had no outlet except war. There is something important to sit with in this timeline. When human historians discuss the ancient history of the galaxy, they typically begin with the Aeldari, a species that had built a civilization spanning the galaxy when humanity was still discovering fire. The Aeldari are considered the ancient race, the elder species, the people who had mastered space travel and psychic arts and interstellar politics long before anyone else. But the Orks were already there when the Aeldari were young. The Orks were already spread across the galaxy, already fighting and spreading, already building the enormous collective pressure that would one day be called the Green Tide. The Aeldari were the new arrivals. The Orks were the permanent residents. When the Necrons finally woke from their 60 million year sleep, they emerged to a galaxy that the Orks had been living in continuously since before their slumber began. The Chaos Gods, born from the accumulated psychic weight of sapient species across the galaxy over vast timescales, came into their full power while the Orks were already ancient. The Emperor of mankind, whose age is measured in tens of thousands of years, is a child of the universe compared to the species he has spent so much of humanity's military power fighting. The Ork race was old when the Emperor was born. By the time the 41st millennium rolls around, the Orks are not a new threat. They are not an emerging problem. They are the oldest ongoing crisis in the galaxy, a species that has been a warlike presence in the universe since before the Aeldari had a civilization, since before humanity had learned to stand upright. Everything else in the setting exists in the aftermath of histories that are centuries or millennia old. The Orks exist in the aftermath of a history that is measured in geological epochs. This is the ground floor of understanding the Orks, not as a rowdy mob of green monsters, but as the living legacy of the most catastrophic conflict the galaxy has ever seen, a weapon that outlasted the war it was made for and has been quietly expanding ever since. Section 3. The biology of violence. What an Ork actually is. If you sat down with a Magos Biologis of the Adeptus Mechanicus and asked them to describe the biology of an Ork, and if that Magos was sufficiently honest and not constrained by the political pressures of the Imperium's institutional insistence on dismissing Ork intelligence, they would probably tell you something deeply uncomfortable. They would tell you that an Ork is, from a purely biological standpoint, one of the most elegant organisms ever to exist in the known galaxy. Start with the fundamental composition. An Ork is not a purely animal organism. It is a genuine biological symbiosis, two entirely different types of living cells, one animal in nature and one fungal, woven together at the most basic cellular level in a partnership so integrated that neither element could function without the other. The animal component gives the Ork its musculature, its nerve function, its animal drive and aggression, and its predatory cognition. The fungal component does something far more interesting. The fungal element in Ork biology effectively replaces several complex internal systems that animals typically require to survive. Where a human needs a functioning immune system, the Ork's fungal biology handles infection and disease with a kind of casual, almost contemptuous efficiency. Where a human needs complex reproductive anatomy, the Ork's fungal biology handles reproduction through an entirely separate mechanism, spore dispersal, that requires no biological investment from the individual Ork at all. Where a human needs intricate organ systems that represent potential points of catastrophic failure, the Ork's fungal biology provides redundancy and supplemental energy in ways that make the whole organism dramatically harder to kill. The green color of an Ork's skin is not incidental. Imperial scholars studying captured skin samples have determined that Ork skin is permeated by a substance chemically similar to the chlorophyll found in plants, and that this substance allows Orks to engage in a crude but genuine form of photosynthesis. Orks, in other words, can draw some of their energy directly from sunlight. This has a staggering tactical implication that military analysts quietly dread. It means that orc logistics, already minimal by any standard, are even less dependent on conventional supply lines than anyone realizes. An orc force does not need to be fed in the way that a human army does. They can raid and forage and hunt, certainly, but they can also simply exist under an open sky and draw sustenance from the light above them. The blood of an orc is equally remarkable. Rather than the relatively simple biological fluid that human blood represents, orc blood is a rich medium of countless distinct fungal organisms, each serving a different purpose within the body's overall economy. The blood's chlorophyll content accounts for its distinctive green color, but the fungal organisms within it are constantly working, sealing wounds, breaking down toxins, repairing tissue damage, fighting infection, and providing supplemental nutrient delivery to whatever part of the body is currently under the greatest stress. The orc head deserves particular attention because it represents perhaps the most famous example of orc biological durability. An orc's skull is dramatically thicker than that of any comparable organism, to the degree that it provides genuine physical protection for the brain housed within it. More astonishing, however, is what happens when that skull is breached or the head is separated from the body entirely. The head of an orc can survive, genuinely, functionally survive, for a measurable period of time after being severed. The fungal biology of an orc is capable of maintaining minimum neurological function even without the heart and other core organs. A decapitated orc head can continue to function at some minimal level for hours. This fact is not merely medically interesting, it is the bread and butter of the orc surgeons known as pain boys, who reattach heads as a matter of routine practice. Then there is the matter of size. Orcs grow throughout their entire lives. Unlike most animal species, which grow rapidly to maturity and then remain largely stable in size, an orc never truly stops growing. More than that, the rate at which an orc grows is directly tied to its success in combat. An orc that wins fights grows faster. An orc that loses less, or survives less, grows more slowly. And being an orc that has been fighting and winning across decades of continuous warfare becomes significantly larger than one that has spent those same years in relative peace. And in orc society, there is essentially no such thing as relative peace. So, what this means in practice is that older orcs are almost invariably larger orcs. The biggest orcs are war bosses, and the biggest war bosses can reach truly staggering sizes. Standard orc boys stand somewhere around 2 meters tall and are built like industrial equipment. Dense, broad, powerful, with a bone density and muscle fiber structure that makes them dramatically tougher than their size would suggest, even in comparison to other large organisms. A senior war boss can be considerably taller than this, broader, heavier, harder to kill, and in possession of a physical strength that can buckle ceramite armor with a single blow. But even ordinary orc boys represent a threat that human commanders consistently underestimate until they have personally witnessed a mob of them in full charge. An orc boy with a crude melee weapon, a hand-forged blade or sharpened piece of structural metal, can still tear through human body armor. They feel pain significantly less than humans do, not because they lack pain receptors, but because the combination of their neurological wiring and their extremely high adrenaline equivalent means that in combat, minor wounds simply do not register. An orc with its arm severed at the shoulder will keep fighting. An orc with multiple bullet wounds to the torso will keep fighting. An orc that has just had its skull fractured by a blunt force impact will keep fighting and probably laugh about it. This durability is not bravado, and it is not fanatical willpower. It is a fundamental biological trait built into the species at the level of cellular structure. Orcs are hard to kill because the old ones designed them to be hard to kill. Every organ system they have is either redundant, protected by additional layers of bone and muscle, or supplemented by the fungal biology that keeps the whole organism running even when specific components fail. Now, here is the part that makes this biological picture genuinely alarming rather than merely impressive. Everything described above applies to an ordinary, living orc. What happens when an orc dies? An orc releases spores throughout its life. These spores are shed from the skin in a constant low-level dispersal that seeds the environment around any orc settlement with dormant biological material. At the moment of death, this release is dramatically amplified. An orc's body, in its final moment, vents the maximum possible concentration of spores into the surrounding environment. These spores can lie dormant in the soil for years, even decades, waiting for conditions that will allow them to germinate. They are extraordinarily resistant to environmental degradation. They can survive extreme temperatures, radiation, chemical contamination, and drought. When they germinate, they do not produce individual orks. They produce a fungal network, a root system, a biological foundation from which the entire orkoid ecosystem can emerge from scratch. First come the squigs, simple crude living things that feed on the fungal material and provide the first link in a food chain. Then come the snotlings, tiny beings who cultivate the fungus and care for the squigs. Then come the Gretchen. And finally, the full orks themselves emerge from the ground, already knowing everything they need to know, ready to fight, ready to breed, ready to spread further. This is why you cannot simply win a battle against the orks and consider the problem solved. If a world has ever hosted a significant ork population, it is probably permanently compromised. Decades after an apparent ork defeat, settlements on a planet that believed itself clean will find themselves facing attacks from feral ork tribes emerging from the wilderness. The spores that were shed during the battle will have spent those decades building toward a new population. You did not win. You only delayed. The Adeptus Mechanicus and the Inquisition know this. They simply do not publicize it widely because the alternative is acknowledging that the standard tactical approach to ork incursions is fundamentally inadequate, and that particular conversation would cause more immediate political problems than the long-term biological ones. There is a phenomenon that imperial xenobiologists have quietly named orkiforming, the slow, inevitable process by which a planet with a long-established ork population begins to change at the biological level. Ork spores do not simply reproduce more orks. They seed the environment with ork-adjacent life forms, with the fungal networks that sustain the orkoid ecosystem, with squig populations that begin replacing native fauna. The native plant and animal life of such a world starts to be crowded out, replaced by the ork ecosystem's components, until eventually the whole planet begins to look like an ork world. Not by design or planning, but simply through the competitive pressure of a biological system that was designed to colonize and dominate its environment. Worlds that have been in ork possession for extended periods show measurable changes in their biospheres that render them increasingly inhospitable to non-orkoid life and increasingly hospitable to the orkoid ecosystem. The orks do not simply conquer worlds. Given enough time, they become them. The process of ork physical maturation also deserves more detailed attention than it typically receives. A young ork, called a youth, emerges from the ground already knowing the basics of how to fight. The encoded knowledge that the old ones built into their genome unfolds as they grow, each developmental stage unlocking new layers of capability and understanding. Within a year, most youths have found their place in ork society, either joining a mob or demonstrating the particular tendencies that mark them as future odd boys. A young ork who spends hours staring at broken machinery and unconsciously begins to reassemble it without knowing why has found his calling as a mech boy. A young ork who develops a tendency to hear the thoughts of those around him and occasionally levitates objects when he gets excited is going to be registered as a weird boy and treated with the particular mixture of respect and terrified distance that their peers reserve for them. The rate at which orks grow is not simply a function of time. An ork in a peaceful environment, a hypothetical that exists almost nowhere in practice, would grow at a predictable biological rate dictated by its metabolic function. An ork in active combat grows faster. The biological mechanism appears to be connected to the same fungal component that provides healing and supplemental energy. Some trigger in the biology responds to the physical demands of combat, to the release of certain hormonal equivalents, to the specific conditions of sustained violent exertion, by accelerating growth processes that would otherwise operate more slowly. The result is that an ork who fights regularly is larger and more physically capable than one who does not, at essentially every stage of its life. This is why ork veterans are not merely experienced. They are physically different from fresh recruits in ways that go beyond skill and technique. A knob who has been fighting for 30 years is measurably larger, denser, tougher, and stronger than the ork who first left the ground. A war boss who has been fighting for 50 years is so far beyond his starting point that the comparison between what he is now and what he was then is almost meaningless. The accumulation of combat experience in an ork manifests not as memories and learned behaviors, though those contribute too, but as literal physical transformation. The Ork body treats fighting as a form of training and responds by building more combat capability, indefinitely, for as long as the Ork survives to continue. This is the biological engine behind the fact that Ork war bosses are genuinely terrifying in close combat. Not because they have had good training, not because they have clever technique, but because they are the product of decades or centuries of continuous combat, and their bodies have been responding to that combat by building more and more and more capability every single time. When Gazgakul Thraka holds his power claw against a Space Marine in full Terminator armor, the outcome is not determined by the Space Marine's superior gene enhancement or the quality of his war gear. It is determined by the fact that Gazgakul has been fighting longer than most Space Marines have been alive, and his body has been getting bigger, stronger, and harder to kill the entire time. Section 4. The Orkoid Ecosystem, Society, Hierarchy, and the Fungal World. If there is one word that people reflexively reach for when describing Ork society, it is chaotic. And superficially, this is defensible. Ork society is loud, violent, constantly shifting, and seemingly held together with nothing more substantial than mutual enthusiasm for hitting things. There are no constitutions, no written laws, no legislative bodies, no courts, no schools, no formal economic institutions, and certainly no retirement plans. But describing Ork society as chaotic in the pejorative sense, as disorganized or dysfunctional, is a fundamental misreading of what it actually is. Ork society is, in its own deeply alien way, extremely efficient. It is simply optimized for a completely different set of priorities than any civilization humanity has ever built. Where human society optimizes for stability, accumulation, and the protection of existing structures, Ork society optimizes for continuous expansion, constant combat readiness, and the perpetual generation of martial excellence. Every element of how Orks organize themselves is in service of those goals, and it serves them spectacularly well. The basic social structure is simple enough to understand at a glance. Size means authority. An Ork who is larger than another Ork is considered to be more powerful, more successful, and therefore more entitled to give orders and receive resources. This is not a metaphor or a social convention, it is a biological reality. Bigger Orks have fought more, won more, and grown as a direct consequence of that winning. Their size is a genuine, honestly earned indicator of their combat capability. The meritocracy of Ork society is brutal, but it is absolutely, unimpeachably genuine. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the Gretchen, often called Grots. These are the small, sharp-faced, mournfully cunning beings who serve as the general labor force of Ork civilization. Gretchen are not stupid, a fact that is easy to miss because they spend most of their time performing an elaborate performance of stupid to avoid being noticed by Orks, who might otherwise decide they need something done right now. A Gretchen who seems too clever might get volunteered for something dangerous. A Gretchen who seems cleverly stupid stays alive. They are the cooks, the message runners, the maintenance crew, the basic infantry cannon fodder, the ammunition carriers, the vehicle loaders, and the general factotums without whom Ork settlements would stop functioning within days. Above the Gretchen are the ordinary Ork boys, the backbone of any fighting force and the primary social group of Ork civilization. Boys organize themselves into mobs, groups of varying size that share a general purpose and a general disposition. Shoota boys prefer ranged combat and carry crude but functional firearms. Choppa boys prefer the up-close and personal approach and carry a variety of bladed, bludgeoning, and generally unpleasant melee weapons. Storm boys strap crude rocket packs to their backs and launch themselves toward the enemy through the air, which should probably be more dangerous than it typically turns out to be. The mob is the fundamental social unit of Ork warfare, and mobs can swell from a handful of boys to hundreds of them, depending on the circumstances. Above the boys are the knobs, the Orks who have fought enough, survived enough, and grown enough to have established genuine authority within their communities. The word itself is an Orkish corruption of the Low Gothic word for noble, which is either an accidental coincidence or evidence that someone in the history of Ork-human contact had a fine sense of irony. Knobs are the local enforcers, the squad leaders, the people who stand between the war boss and the general mob, and make sure that the war boss's extremely direct communication style is properly interpreted. They dress better, carry better weapons, have access to better resources, and absolutely do not hesitate to remind everyone around them of these facts through the most direct means available. At the top of the structure is the war boss, and the war boss is a figure who deserves considerably more respect than they typically receive in cultural discussion of the 40,000 universe. A war boss is not simply the biggest orc. A war boss is the biggest orc who has also survived long enough, fought widely enough, and won consistently enough that they have grown to a size that makes challengers hesitate. That hesitation is itself a kind of social technology. It creates a stable apex predator at the top of the hierarchy who can direct the general aggression of the mob outward, rather than allowing it to perpetually tear the group apart from within. When a war boss gathers enough followers and demonstrates enough victories that orcs from surrounding tribes begin to arrive, drawn by the psychic resonance of building power, by word of good fighting to be had, by the simple biological imperative towards strength, a larger-scale force begins to form. This process, once it begins, tends to accelerate. More orcs means more victories. More victories means a larger war boss. A larger war boss draws more orcs. Eventually, if the momentum is strong enough and the war boss kunnin enough, a genuine migration of violence forms. The mass mobilization that the galaxy has come to dread. The economy of orc society is as elegantly simple as its hierarchy. The currency is teeth, not metaphorically, but literally. Orc teeth, called teeth in the language, serve as the medium of exchange for everything from food to weapons to vehicle parts to political alliances. What makes this currency function beautifully is the biological fact that orc teeth grow back. An orc that loses its teeth in combat will regrow them within weeks. This means that the currency supply is perpetually being replenished from within the population itself, making inflation essentially impossible, while also ensuring that every orc, no matter how poor or unfortunate, always has some access to the basic economic system. The teeth also degrade over time, which prevents anyone from hoarding unlimited wealth indefinitely. A bag of teeth will buy a cheap vehicle. A war boss level collection of teeth could fund an invasion. What this economic system creates in practice is a society where wealth is tied to biological capability. The bigger your teeth, the more they are worth. And bigger teeth correlate with larger orcs, which correlate with more successful fighters. The economy and the social hierarchy reinforce each other in a system that, from the outside, looks chaotic, but from the inside has a beautiful internal consistency. Bad Moon orcs, whose teeth grow faster than those of other clans, are naturally the wealthiest orcs in any gathering. They did not earn this through clever investment. They earned it simply by being born a certain kind of orc, and the economy rewards them for it. Other orcs find this intensely aggravating, which is probably how the Bad Moons like it. The concept of property rights in orc society is similarly fascinating in its elegant simplicity. You own what you can take and hold. If you can hold it against everyone else who wants it, it is yours. If someone takes it from you, it is theirs. And if you can take it back, it becomes yours again. There are no deeds, no contracts, no inheritance laws, no intellectual property protections. There is only the current state of who is physically in possession of something, and whether anyone is actively trying to change that. A mech boy's tools are his because he is almost certainly the most dangerous thing in the immediate vicinity at any given moment, and challenging that assumption tends to end badly for whoever makes the attempt. A war boss's vehicle is his because it would take an implausibly large mob to take it from him, and by the time that mob was assembled, someone in it would have become the new war boss, and the vehicle would be his instead. Language deserves a moment in this discussion, because orc communication is another area where casual dismissal hides genuine complexity. The orc language, which the Imperium has transcribed in various ways across different codexes and background materials, is crude in vocabulary, but not actually limited in expressive capacity. Orcs can and do communicate sophisticated tactical information, emotional states, theological arguments, and historical narratives in their language. They simply do all of this with a vocabulary that prioritizes the most important categories of orc experience. Things you can hit, things that can hit you, things that make noise, things that go fast, and the various gradations of how good or bad a fight was. Within these categories, the nuance can be remarkable. There are apparently at least 11 distinct words for different qualities of a fight that was extremely good in the specific way that involves hitting something very hard and it breaking satisfyingly, and Ork veterans will argue at length about which of these 11 categories a particular engagement falls into. The squigs deserve their own moment of appreciation in this section, because they represent one of the most interesting pieces of the Orkoid ecosystem. Squigs are the simplest product of the Orkoid spore system, small, aggressive, round-bodied creatures that exist in dozens of distinct varieties, each filling a different ecological and practical niche. Eating squigs are basically living nutrient packages, a food source that follows the orc army wherever it goes and requires no cultivation because they breed on fungal matter that orcs produce naturally. Oil squigs produce a lubricating substance that mech boys use to keep machinery running. Mending squigs are used by pain boys to close wounds, their biology apparently suited to some kind of coagulant or sealing function. Hair squigs serve as a fashion statement. Attack squigs function as guard animals, watch creatures, and in a pinch as thrown improvised weapons. Because an orc who picks up a bite-happy spherical predator and hurls it at an enemy has technically achieved both a ranged attack and a melee deployment simultaneously, and this kind of creative tactical thinking is why orcs win more battles than anyone expects. The entire orkoid ecosystem, orcs, Gretchen, snotlings, squigs in all their variety, travels with every force. Every orc settlement, every space fleet, every marching warband carries within itself the biological seeds of a complete, functioning society. There is no supply chain that can be cut. There is no logistics network that can be disrupted. The orcs simply bring everything they need inside their own bodies and the bodies of the creatures that travel with them. Against a conventional military doctrine built around interdicting supply lines and choking off resources, this makes orc forces essentially impossible to starve out or run dry. Section 5. The 6 Great Clans, a galaxy of distinct cultures. One of the most misunderstood things about the orcs is the degree to which they represent genuine cultural diversity. The assumption that all orcs are the same, loud, green, and interested only in hitting things harder dissolves the moment you spend any serious time with the lore of the Great Clans. The 6 major orc clans, which are found in significant numbers in almost every orc gathering across the galaxy, are distinct cultures with their own philosophies, their own aesthetics, their own preferred approaches to war, and their own deeply held beliefs about what it means to be a proper orc. Understanding the clans is essential to understanding why orc society, for all its apparent disorder, generates such spectacular variety and such concentrated excellence in specific fields. The Goths are the clan most people picture when they think of orcs. They are the largest, the most aggressive, the most physically powerful, and the most disdainful of anything that smells like cleverness or strategy. Goths wear black, or at least they wear as much black as they can keep clean enough to still be identifiably black, which in a society that produces as much mess as orc civilization does, is more of an aspirational color choice than a practical one. They believe that the proper way to win a fight is to walk directly into the enemy and keep hitting until either you are dead or they are. And since Goths are extremely difficult to kill, this approach works more often than tactical purists are comfortable admitting. What makes Goths culturally interesting beyond pure brute force is their genuine contempt for what they call flash. A Goth orc who spends time decorating his armor or painting his vehicle is an embarrassment to his clan. A Goth orc who wins a fight through some clever tactical maneuver, rather than direct confrontation, is regarded with something approaching suspicion. Purity of purpose, pure uncut combat for its own sake, is the highest Goth virtue. The greatest orc in current galactic history, Gazg-Kul Mag Uruk Thraka, is a Goth, and while Gazg-Kul has demonstrated tactical capabilities that most Goths would find frankly disturbing, the core of his character, the overwhelming forward momentum, the personal joy of the fight, is deeply, fundamentally Goth. Then there are the Bad Moons. If the Goths represent the austere heart of orc martial culture, the Bad Moons represent everything that lies at the opposite end of the wealth spectrum. Bad Moon orcs have a biological quirk that makes them the wealthiest orcs in virtually any gathering. Their teeth grow faster than those of other clans, meaning that their personal currency supply regenerates at a higher rate than anyone else's. They are, by orc standards, filthy rich, and they want everyone to know it. Bad Moon weaponry is the most expensive, the most elaborately decorated, and typically the most powerful available. Where a Goth orc might carry a basic choppa and a standard-issue shuta, A Bad Moon Nob is likely to be carrying a custom-built weapon encrusted with gold plating and equipped with modifications that a mech boy spent weeks installing, specifically because the customer insisted on the most expensive possible option. Their armor is painted in bright yellows and adorned with checkerboard patterns that announce their wealth, with the subtlety of a gargant stepping on a hab block. There is a surprising proportion of weird boys among the Bad Moons, possibly because the kind of orc that spends a lot of time thinking about wealth and status is also the kind of orc that ends up doing a lot more thinking in general, and thinking orcs are more likely to manifest psychic sensitivity. Whatever the reason, Bad Moon forces often have access to more psychic power than equivalent forces from other clans, which combined with their superior equipment makes them a genuinely dangerous fighting force, if you are ever foolish enough to assume that wealth means softness. The Evil Sons are the speed specialists, and they embrace this identity with an enthusiasm that borders on religious fervor. If it has wheels, the Evil Sons want it. If it has treads, they want it. If it has jet engines, or rocket boosters, or any form of propulsion that allows it to cover ground faster than a walking orc, they absolutely must have it. And the moment they have it, they will paint it red, because every Evil Sons orc knows in the core of their being that red ones go faster. This is not superstition. This is, as we will discuss in detail later, actually true in the most genuinely unsettling way possible. The collective psychic belief of millions of orcs has made it true. Evil Sons forces are characterized by absolute constant motion. They do not hold defensive lines. They do not besiege positions. They charge, they hit hard, they circle around, and they charge again. Their war bosses are lighter armored and faster moving than most orc leaders, because in Evil Sons culture, the ability to get to the fight first is valued almost as highly as the ability to win it. Their affection for vehicles extends to a kind of technical appreciation that edges toward the emotional. An Evil Sons mech boy who has built a particularly fine bike will speak about it with a warmth that suggests something closer to partnership than mere ownership. The Death Skulls operate according to a philosophy that is simultaneously the most pragmatic and the most superstitious of all the clans. They are looters. They are scavengers. They believe that blue is lucky, and they paint themselves, their equipment, and everything they own in shades of blue to attract the favor of fortune. They believe, with complete conviction, that acquiring something that belonged to someone you have just killed passes that person's fighting spirit into the object, making it more powerful. This belief has led to Death Skulls forces fielding truly extraordinary collections of stolen and repurposed technology from every faction imaginable. Eldar vehicles with crude orc weapon mounts bolted onto them, Imperial tanks painted blue and fitted with orc crew compartments, Necron components harvested from destroyed dynasties and incorporated into devices whose precise function even the mech boy who built them would struggle to explain. The practical effect of this philosophy is that Death Skulls forces are deeply unpredictable in terms of capability. You genuinely cannot know what technology they might bring to a fight, because it depends entirely on what they manage to steal from the last battle. They have been known to show up with functional Eldar weapon systems, modified Imperial war engines, and in at least one legendary case, repurposed Necron resurrection matrices that were supposedly providing the Orc boys some crude version of the regenerative immortality the Necrons use for themselves. Whether that last one was real or merely an extremely persistent rumor is unclear, but the fact that it is plausible is itself a Death Skulls achievement. The Blood Axes are the clan that makes other orcs deeply uncomfortable, and the reason is simple. Blood Axes have been observing their enemies too closely. They have been watching how human soldiers fight, the use of cover, the deployment of flanking maneuvers, the value of coordinated tactical movements. And they have found these observations interesting enough to actually incorporate some of them into their own approach. Blood Axes use camouflage. They plan ambushes. They have been known to enter temporary negotiations with non-orc forces when it served their tactical interests. They have even, in recorded history, retreated from fights they were losing, a concept so alien to standard orc psychology that many other orc clans regard it with a mixture of bafflement and contempt. This means that Blood Axes produce more than their share of the thinking, planning war bosses who go on to lead some of the most genuinely dangerous military campaigns in orc history. The tactical vocabulary they have absorbed from Centuries of studying their enemies gives them a sophistication that pure brute force clans cannot match in certain situations, particularly in extended campaigns across varied terrain. Other orcs think blood axes are weird. Blood axes are fine with that, as long as other orcs keep underestimating them. Finally, the snakebites represent the traditionalist heart of orc culture, the faction that looks at all this newfangled technology with deep suspicion and prefers to do things the way orcs have always done them, which means riding into battle on the backs of giant tusked boars and other native beasts, fighting with choppas and spears, and demonstrating strength through personal courage rather than machine power. They are the closest thing orc culture has to an agrarian society, living more closely to the land and the native creatures of whatever world they inhabit. They keep squigs not just as food sources, but as companions, mounts, and weapons in their own right. The snakebite's rejection of technology is culturally fascinating because it exists alongside a genuine expertise with living things that the other clans cannot match. Snakebite animal handlers, called runthirds when they work with Gretchen, but operating under various titles when handling the larger beasts of their warband, can control creatures that would terrify any other handler in the galaxy. A snakebite warband riding into battle on a herd of squigoths, massive armored megafauna that exist at the intersection of tank and living battering ram, is a sight that has ended more than one Imperial commander's confidence in their defensive preparations. The 6 clans are not a complete accounting of orc cultural diversity. There are dozens of smaller clans beyond these 6 major ones, each with their own specific identities, their own warfare styles, their own particular view on what makes a good fight and a proper orc. There are the freebooters, who fall outside the clan structure entirely, pirates, mercenaries, wanderers who have left their clans for various reasons and operate as independent operators for hire. There are the Grot's Rebellion lore threads, the idea that Gretchen sometimes develop revolutionary consciousness and attempt to organize against their orc masters, which is either deeply admirable or extremely funny depending on your perspective. And the orc perspective on this is that it is both. There are the commandos who transcend clan affiliations through their professional identity. And there are the beast snagas, who are not precisely a clan but a cultural movement cutting across clan lines, bound by their shared obsession with hunting the largest prey the galaxy has to offer. All of this variety is part of what makes the orcs the faction they are. They are not a monoculture. They are not a single thing. They are a galaxy-spanning collection of distinct warrior cultures, each one optimizing for a different dimension of violence, each one contributing something different to the overall ecology of orc civilization. When a large mobilization gathers orcs from multiple clans together, it is not just a larger army. It is an army that contains dedicated melee shock troops and speed-based cavalry and long-range fire support and stealth infiltrators and scavenged heavy vehicles and traditional beast-riding cavalry and the occasional, extremely enthusiastic pyrotechnician. The combined arms capability of a multi-clan orc force is significantly greater than any individual clan could achieve on its own, and the war bosses who understand how to deploy that combination are the ones who go on to be remembered. After that first section, I want to take a moment and say, if you are enjoying this exploration so far, please leave a comment below. It genuinely helps more than most people realize. Tell me which orc clan you think is the most underrated. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a perfect time to do that. There is a lot more to cover today. Section 6. The Odd Boys, the specialists who hold it all together. The clan structure of orc society tells you how orcs are organized in broad cultural terms. But within every clan, every warband, every mob of boys gathering under a particular war boss, there is a parallel structure of specialists whose roles are as essential to orc civilization as any engineer or doctor or priest in a human society. These are the Odd Boys. Orcs who have been born with an instinctive specialization that makes them fundamentally different from the standard orc boy in ways that the orc community genuinely depends on. The most important thing to understand about all Odd Boys is the mechanism behind their specialization. They did not attend a school or complete an apprenticeship or pass an examination. They were born with their knowledge. The technical information required for their role was encoded in their genetic material by the old ones long before any individual Odd Boy's parents were born. As an Odd Boy grows, the relevant knowledge unfolds within their mind, not as a learned memory, but as an innate understanding. as natural and automatic as the way a human infant knows to reach for comfort, or the way a bird knows to migrate without ever having been taught the route. A mech boy, who has never seen a working engine in his life, will instinctively grasp the principles of how that engine functions the moment he examines it. A pain boy who has never studied anatomy will understand the internal organization of an orc's body with a thoroughness that would take a human surgeon years of study to match. They simply know. The old ones put the knowledge there, and it stays. The mech boys, often called mechaniacs, or simply mechs, are the engineers and inventors of orc society, and they represent one of the most fascinating expressions of the orcoid biological gift. A mech boy's brain is wired to perceive mechanical systems the way a musician perceives harmony, not as a collection of separate parts, but as an integrated whole, each element's purpose immediately obvious, each potential modification instantly visible. Give a mech boy a pile of scrap metal, and he will see in it the machine that it could become, and his hands will start moving toward that machine almost before the thought has fully formed. The resulting technology is famously, almost aggressively, ugly. Orc vehicles are welded and bolted and clamped and nailed together from components that were never designed to work with each other, that came from different species' manufacturing traditions, that were recovered from battlefields in varying states of damage and repaired with whatever was available. An orc buggy might have a human engine, Eldar steering components, armored plating from an Imperial tank, and a gun that was assembled from parts belonging to at least 4 different weapon systems, and then extensively modified by a mech boy who had very specific ideas about what the final product should look like. It is a mess. It works anyway, and in some inexplicable cases, it works extraordinarily well. The reason it works connects to something profound about what orcs actually are at a psychic level, which we will explore in detail in the next section. But the mech boys are the focal point of this effect. Their belief in their creations, their absolute certainty that the machine they have built will function as intended, plays a direct role in whether it actually does. The big mechs are the mech boys who have grown in skill and size to the point where they lead entire workshops of lesser mechs and can create truly extraordinary devices. The shock attack gun, a weapon that functions by shoving snotlings through subspace and having them emerge inside enemy vehicles in a state of absolute terror-induced detonation, is a big mech creation. The teleporta, which teleports orc forces across vast distances with success rates that the Imperium finds statistically impossible, is a big mech creation. The custom force field, which generates a protective energy barrier from components that should not be capable of generating an energy barrier, is a big mech creation. A big mech named Orchimedes, whose actual identity the Imperium's Death Watch have spent years trying to establish and whose face no agent of the Inquisition has ever actually seen, has been credited with some of the most spectacular orc technological achievements of recent centuries, including a device called the Mega Tele Shaka that successfully teleported millions of orcs and their entire fleet across impossible distances simultaneously during one of Gazg'Kul's campaigns. The Adeptus Mechanicus's response to learning about this device was reportedly that it was physically impossible. The Orks' response to the Adeptus Mechanicus's opinion was to use it anyway. The Pain Boys occupy the intersection of medicine and horror with a cheerfulness that says everything about the orc worldview. They are orc surgeons, and they operate with the complete self-assurance of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, even when the available evidence suggests otherwise. Their operating theaters are whatever flat surface is nearest to the battlefield. Their instruments are whatever they have to hand, which often includes choppas used for cutting, power tools used for drilling, and mending squigs used for stitching. Anesthesia is administered by hitting the patient over the head, which pain boys have long maintained is medically adequate, and which patients are generally in no position to contradict at the relevant moment. Despite all of this, pain boys work. They reattach severed limbs, they perform brain surgery with success rates that should be impossible given their methods. They install cybernetic enhancements that function correctly, or at least function in ways that kill the patient less often than pure luck would predict. They have been known to reattach orc heads that have been separated from their bodies, a procedure that in any other species would represent the outer boundary of medical impossibility. Their biological instinct for how an orc body is organized, the same deep genetic knowledge that the old ones encoded into every odd boy, means that a pain boy's hands know where everything should be even when the current patient's insides suggest that someone has put them somewhere else. Mad Doc Grotznik is the most famous pain boy in orc history, a being so consumed by surgical enthusiasm and the opportunity for creative cybernetic modification that he occupies a special position in the lore. His most significant contribution to history was the surgery he performed on a young, critically wounded orc named Gazg'Kul, whose skull had been shattered by an Imperial bolter round during a Space Marine raid on his home planet. Grotznik rebuilt Gazg'Kul's skull from adamantium, the same material used in the most advanced Imperial armor systems, and in doing so, apparently unlocked something within Gazg'Kul's brain that changed the course of orc history. Whether this was a deliberate surgical achievement or a magnificent accident remains unknown. The results, however, are not in dispute. The Weird Boys are the psychers of orc civilization, and they are among the most genuinely terrifying individuals in any fighting force, if you are on the wrong side of them. What makes Weird Boys unique even in the context of psychers across all species is the mechanism of their power. They are not drawing directly on the raw psychic energy of the warp, in the way that human or Eldari psychers do. They are drawing on the collective psychic field, generated by all the orcs around them. The enormous, constant, low-level psychic output that billions of orcs produce simply by existing and fighting and believing. The result is that a weird boy in the middle of a large orc force is literally surrounded by a building reservoir of psychic energy that keeps filling up the more excited the orcs around him get. A weird boy at the center of a charging mob of thousands of orcs in full battle cry is experiencing something that has no equivalent in any other psychic tradition. The raw, accumulated belief energy of an entire species focused through a single channel. If they can discharge it, the results are spectacular. If they cannot, their own head explodes, and the heads of several nearby orcs. Other orcs find this entertaining. Weird boys are consequently treated with a peculiar mixture of reverence and nervous distance in orc society. They are kept in specially constructed houses built on copper stilts, designed to channel excess psychic energy into the ground. They wear bells and noisy clothing specifically so that other orcs can hear them approaching and step aside in time. They are assigned bodyguards called Minders, whose primary job is to prevent uncontrolled weird boy discharges by managing the social environment around their charge. When a weird boy is brought to battle, the calculation is simple and very orc: enormous potential benefit, serious risk to anyone standing nearby, completely worth it. Finally, the run-thirds, the slave drivers, the animal handlers, the cultivators of the Gretchen and Snotling populations, who serve as the orcoid labor force. Run-thirds are not spectacular in the way that mech boys or weird boys are, but they represent a critical social function. They manage the enormous numbers of smaller beings that orc civilization requires to function, keeping the Gretchen productive enough to be useful while ensuring they are not free enough to be dangerous. It is in many ways the most thankless job in orc society, and probably the most honest. A run-third is simply someone who has taken responsibility for the most tedious necessary work, so that everyone else can get on with the fighting. Section 7. The Psychic Green Tide, Gork, Mork, and the Power of Belief. Here is the part of orc lore that, once you truly understand it, fundamentally changes how you perceive the entire faction. Not the biology, not the clans, not the individual warriors or warlords, but the metaphysics, the strange, frightening, deeply fascinating question of what orcs actually are at a psychic level, and what that means for the universe they inhabit. Every sentient species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe generates psychic energy. This is a fundamental fact of how the setting works. The thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and spiritual experiences of all thinking beings produce a kind of resonance in the parallel dimension known as the warp, the mirror universe of pure psychic energy that underlies normal space. Strong enough concentrations of this resonance take on distinct shapes and personalities within the warp. Human fear and suffering has produced the Chaos Gods. Eldari excess and refined sensation helped produce Slaanesh. And the deep, broad emotional currents of humanity have given form to entities both benevolent and monstrous within the immaterium. The orcs are no exception to this principle. Their collective psychic presence in the warp is enormous. larger, possibly, than that of any other single species, because there are simply more of them than there are members of any other intelligent race. When billions of orcs feel the same thing, think the same thing, want the same thing, that collective resonance builds in the warp into something of almost incomprehensible power and simplicity. The orcs believe in fighting. They believe in being strong. They believe in winning. And out of these beliefs, shaped by the accumulated psychic output of a species that has been fighting and winning and believing in those things for hundreds of millions of years, there emerge two entities, Gork and Mork. Gork is brutal but Kunin. Mork is Kunin but brutal. Orcs argue endlessly about which is which, and these arguments have caused wars within the broader framework of wars that orc civilization perpetually runs. What is certain is that both entities are as real, within the context of warp metaphysics, as anything else that exists within that dimension. They manifest as two enormous, impossibly powerful presences, warlike, aggressive, enormously loud, radiating a kind of cheerful menace that is very specific to the orc worldview. Orc gargants, those titanic walking war engines that are the orc equivalent of an imperial titan, are built as physical effigies of Gork and Mork. The mech boys who design them receive visions, actual psychic communications from their gods, that shape the final design of each gargant, which is why every single one looks different, and yet every single one manages to look unmistakably orky. But Gork and Mork, while impressive in their own right, are not the most interesting aspect of orc psychic reality. The most interesting aspect is what the entire species does unconsciously, all the time, without knowing it or meaning to. Every orc generates a low-level psychic field. This is not a special gift or an unusual mutation. It is simply part of what an orc is, woven into their biology as surely as the fungal cells in their bloodstream. Individually, this field is too weak to do much of anything. But orcs are never alone. They are always in mobs, in war bands, in armies, in enormous migrating hordes. And when many orcs are in close proximity, their individual psychic fields overlap and reinforce each other, building into a collective resonance that has measurable effects on physical reality. This collective field, which the orcs themselves call the energy of their great marching armies, though they do not fully understand its nature, has the property of making orc beliefs true. Not all beliefs, not always completely, not without limit, but within a certain range of possibility, a thing that enough orcs believe will function as though it is true, because the collective psychic pressure they are unconsciously exerting on reality is sufficient to bridge the gap between what should be possible and what actually happens. The most famous example of this is the red vehicles phenomenon. Evil Sun's orcs paint their vehicles red because they believe red ones go faster. This belief is shared so completely, so unreservedly, by so many orcs across the entire species that the collective psychic field actually makes it true. Red orc vehicles do, measurably, perform at higher speeds than equivalent vehicles in other colors. The Adeptus Mechanicus has verified this experimentally. They have no explanation for it that does not require accepting that orc belief is literally restructuring local reality to conform to orc expectations. Yellow rockets make bigger explosions, for the same reason. Blue paint is lucky for death skulls, making their owners statistically more likely to survive. Certain totems and glyphs work exactly as advertised, because every orc who has ever seen those totems believes they work, and that collective belief is what makes them functional. Orc weapons that should not work, that should misfire, or fail, or simply not operate correctly given the quality of their construction, work because the orc carrying them absolutely believes they will work, and that belief is reinforced by the psychic field of every other orc in the vicinity. This has a profound implication that military analysts tend to avoid examining directly. The larger an orc force becomes, the stronger the collective psychic field. The stronger the collective psychic field, the more effectively orc belief translates into reality. A single orc with a crude weapon is a dangerous individual. 1,000 orcs with crude weapons are a powerful combat force. 1,000,000 orcs with crude weapons are an entity that is quietly reshaping the local physics to favor their success. 1,000,000,000 orcs, unified under a single powerful leader, would represent a psychic pressure so enormous that the outcome of their campaigns might owe less to conventional military factors than to something closer to a force of nature. The great marching army of the orcs is not merely a military formation. It is a collective consciousness, not intelligent, not coordinated in any way that its participants are aware of, but genuinely reshaping the world around it through the sheer accumulated weight of shared belief. The warp, which reflects all psychic activity, surges in response to Ork collective energy. The gods, Gork and Mork, grow stronger. The weird boys become more powerful. The weapons become more effective. The Orks themselves become larger, stronger, faster, harder to kill. There is a theory among certain inquisitorial scholars, kept extremely quiet for reasons that should be obvious, that the great Ork mobilizations of history have not simply been military events. They have been psychic events, moments when the collective consciousness of the Ork race has briefly achieved a kind of resonance that affects not just individual battles, but the broader fabric of reality in the affected regions. The damage done to the warp in areas of intense, prolonged Ork activity is measurable. The echo of a major Ork campaign lingers in the immaterium for centuries after the last shot is fired. What the Orks are, in psychic terms, is the most powerful latent consciousness in the known galaxy, operating just below the threshold of its own self-awareness. Consider what this means for the long arc of galactic history. The Chaos Gods draw their power from the emotions of thinking beings, fear, rage, pleasure, despair, collected over millennia in vast reservoirs within the warp. This process took eons to produce the current power of the ruinous powers. But the Orks have been generating their own particular flavor of psychic resonance, the uncomplicated, overwhelming joy of violence, the pure, unambiguous satisfaction of a good fight, the collective confidence of a species that genuinely does not understand the concept of self-doubt. For a comparable span of time, Gork and Mork are not minor warp entities. They are ancient, massive presences, grown enormous on the accumulated spiritual output of a species that has been fighting non-stop since before the current Chaos Gods reached their full power. Imperial scholars who have had the misfortune of examining Ork territory in the Immaterium describe the psychic signature of a large Ork force as something that is simultaneously alarming and, in a deeply disturbing way, invigorating. There is a raw energy to it, nothing subtle or complex, nothing like the intricate emotional webs that human psychic presence creates, but a tremendous, direct, almost physical force. Like standing near a waterfall, like being next to an engine running at full capacity. The warp near a large Ork army is turbulent, yes, but it is turbulent in a way that is directional, purposeful, consistently oriented toward one thing and one thing only. Forward, into the fight, louder, faster, more. The collective field also has one property that should deeply concern any strategist thinking about the long term. It is cumulative. A single Ork fight adds a tiny increment to the total reserve. 1,000 fights add more. A war that lasts a year adds considerably more. A war that has lasted 3 centuries, like the ongoing conflict on Armageddon, adds, slowly, continuously, an enormous amount of raw psychic energy to the reserve that Gork and Mork represent. And unlike human souls that are consumed by the warp through suffering and corruption, Ork psychic output is not consumed. It accumulates. It builds. The more they fight, the stronger the tide becomes. This is the deepest reason why Commissar Yarek's famous line about the Orks resonates with those who understand it fully. He was not speaking purely of military capability when he said that an Ork is dangerous. He was speaking of something more fundamental, that an Ork in battle is a small piece of something much larger, that the individual warrior with his crude weapon and his green skin and his complete certainty that he will win is connected to a river of psychic force that has been flowing since before human civilization existed and is flowing still, and that river is running faster now than it has in a very long time. Section 8. The War Machines, Gargants, Stompus, and the Art of Orky Engineering. When an Ork mech boy looks at an Imperial Titan, one of those cathedral-scale walking war engines that represent the pinnacle of the Adeptus Mechanicus's engineering tradition, ancient machines maintained by priests who have spent their entire lives studying a single system, he does not feel awe. He does not feel inadequacy. He looks at it, and then he looks at the scrap around him, and then something in his head begins working in the way that only a mech boy's head can work. And he starts to build. The result, eventually, is a Gargant. Gargants are the Ork answer to the Imperial Titan, And the most important thing to understand about them is that they are built from whatever materials happen to be available, using construction techniques that no engineering textbook has ever described, assembled by mech boys who are operating on pure instinct, and they work. Not reliably, not safely, not in the way that anything with as many moving parts as a Gargant really has any right to work. But they work often enough, destructively enough, and in combination with the collective psychic field effect that makes Ork technology in general perform above its theoretical specifications. The smallest of the Gargant family, if small is really a word you can use for something that stands as tall as a 4-story building, are the Stampas. A Stampa is built as a fat-bellied, aggressive-looking effigy of the Ork gods because the mech boys who receive the vision that drives them to build one are receiving that vision from Gork and Mork themselves. And Gork and Mork apparently have very specific ideas about what their physical representatives should look like. Every Stampa has a vast internal space that functions as a troop carrier. An Ork force can embed a full mob of boys inside a Stampa, then disgorge them directly into the enemy lines after the Stampa has smashed through whatever was in the way. Their armament is a feast of engineering chaos. The standard Stampa mounts a weapon the mech boys call the Def Cannon, a ballistic weapon of staggering destructive yield, firing armor-piercing high-explosive shells that produce blasts large enough to obliterate entire squads and damage heavy vehicles. Alongside this, the Super Gatler provides an alternative option, a rotary cannon of preposterously large caliber that fires continuous streams of shells at rates that seem, from the outside, to simply be a continuous column of metal and fire directed at whatever the Ork in the control cabin has decided to look at that moment. Supporting these primary weapons is an array of secondary systems, rockets, heavy bolter equivalents, close-range defense weapons, that together make a Stampa genuinely capable of engaging almost any target in the galaxy. The Mega Choppa is the Stampa's primary close combat weapon. A chainsaw arm scaled up to the point where it can saw through the side of a super heavy battle tank with about the same effort that an ordinary chainsaw applies to a softwood plank. In combat, a Stampa using its Mega Choppa can reach through a building and pull out whatever was sheltering inside it. It can bisect a vehicle that its shooting has failed to destroy. It can pin down an enemy force that has gotten too close simply by swinging the arm in a wide arc and letting physics complete the argument. Above the Stampa in scale are the Great Gargants, genuinely Titan-class machines that can match the combat capability of the Imperial Warlord Titans that represent humanity's largest walking war engines. Great Gargants have been encountered by Imperial commanders who assumed, upon seeing them for the first time, that they were some kind of stationary fortification. They are not stationary. They move with the inexorable, grinding momentum of a geological event. And when their primary weapons systems, which can include weapons powerful enough to wipe out entire armies in a single discharge, come to bear on a target, the target stops being a tactical consideration and starts being a historical footnote. At the absolute apex of Ork engineering ambition stands the Mega Gargant, which is not really a vehicle in any conventional sense, but rather a mobile fortress, a tracked structure so large that it rivals the size of the most massive Imperial war engines ever constructed. Mega Gargants are built for the largest wars, the grandest campaigns, the moments when a war boss has decided that subtle is a word from some other species' dictionary, and what the situation actually calls for is an object so large and so comprehensively armed that its arrival on a battlefield constitutes a kind of argument that no rebuttal has yet been successfully composed. During the War of the Beast, which we will address in detail shortly, the Orks fielded a Gargant so enormous that it was city-sized, a structure in which full-scale Stampas could travel through the internal corridors as though through streets. Its primary weapon could eliminate entire armies in a single discharge. It took the combined assault of thousands of Space Marines, led by the Primarch Vulcan himself, boarding and fighting through the interior to destroy it from the inside, because no external weapon system available to the Imperium at the time was adequate for the task. Beyond the Gargants, Ork vehicle culture encompasses everything from the humble, rickety truck, an open-topped transport vehicle that functions primarily by going very fast and hoping that the enemy does not shoot it before it gets where it is going, to the battle wagon, a heavy tracked vehicle that serves as the Ork equivalent of a main battle tank, to the bewildering variety of specialized vehicles that emerge from the cult of speed and related speed freak traditions. The cult of speed is an orc cultural movement rather than a single clan, though it draws most heavily from the Evil Sons. Its adherents have elevated the pursuit of velocity to something approaching a spiritual practice. They modify vehicles to go faster. They remove anything that weighs the vehicle down, including in some cases armor that is technically necessary for the crew's survival. They add more engines. They add bigger engines. They replace the engines with even bigger engines. The resulting machines achieve speeds that should be physically impossible for vehicles of their size and construction, and they achieve them while carrying crews who seem, by their behavior, to be having the best time of their lives. Defcoptas are single orc helicopter analogs, improvised rotorcraft that manage to be both aloft and functional through a combination of engineering instinct and optimistic expectation. War tracks and war buggies are small, fast attack vehicles suited to harassing larger targets while staying outside their effective response range, a tactic that requires going very fast, which is why they are popular with speed freak pilots. Battle wagons are converted from virtually anything that can carry armor and weapons, including in several recorded cases decommissioned Imperial vehicles that Death Skulls had acquired, repainted, and modified to the point where their original owners would not recognize them. The core principle underlying all of this, the technical chaos, the improvised construction, the vehicles that should not work and do anyway, is the same principle that underlies all of Orc society. The Orcs do not think like engineers thinking about machinery. They think like beings who were designed to fight, for whom war is as natural as breathing, for whom a vehicle is not a sophisticated technical system, but a means of getting to the fight faster and hitting harder when you get there. The engineering follows from the purpose, and the purpose is so deeply embedded in what the Orcs are that everything they build, consciously or unconsciously, optimizes for that purpose. The Def Dread and the Kilikon deserve their own moment of appreciation in this discussion, because they represent a uniquely Orc approach to the Walker combat vehicle concept that every other faction in the game employs in various forms. A Space Marine Dreadnought is a venerated warrior, entombed in a life support sarcophagus within a walking battle chassis, a hero preserved beyond death in service to his chapter. It is a solemn, sacred thing, treated with enormous ceremony and reverence. A Kilikon is a giant metal canister on piston-driven legs, built around a Gretchen pilot who has been welded inside because the mech boy could not figure out a workable door mechanism, and was not particularly concerned by this design oversight. The Gretchen inside is absolutely terrified. It is also not going anywhere. It fires the weapons because the alternative to firing the weapons is probably worse than firing the weapons. The Kilikon is to the Dreadnought what an improvised explosive is to a shaped charge. Cruder, messier, less precise, but present in much larger numbers and considerably cheaper to replace. Def Dreads are the larger version, closer in scale and capability to the Space Marine variant, and they are usually crewed by an Orc rather than a Gretchen. An Orc in a Def Dread is a genuinely dangerous combatant. The combination of the Orc's natural aggression, its biological resistance to pain and injury, and the mechanical enhancement of the Walker chassis produces something that can trade blows with almost any equivalent unit in the game. The Orc inside the Dread is not a tragic figure preserved against death. It is an Orc who looked at a giant walking weapon system and decided, enthusiastically and voluntarily, that being inside it sounded brilliant. The contrast with the Dreadnought tradition says everything about the fundamental philosophical difference between Orc culture and every other culture in the setting. The Morkanaut and Gorkanaut represent the upper tier of Orc Walker technology below the Gargant classification, enormous walking war engines that mount some of the most powerful weapons in the Orc arsenal. The Morkanaut's defining feature is its custom force field, a device that generates a genuine energy shield around itself and nearby friendly units. That this works at all is entirely attributable to the Gestalt psychic field effect. A custom force field is not, by any conventional analysis of its physical components, capable of producing an energy shield. And yet it does. The belief of the mech boy who built it, reinforced by the collective certainty of every Orc nearby that the big mech knows what he is doing, bridges the gap between theoretical impossibility and practical function. The Gorkanaut takes a different approach, dispensing with the field generator in favor of more and bigger weapons, which is the Gork to the Morkanaut's Mork, pure aggression versus cunning aggression. Its main weapon, the Deathstorm Mega Shooter, fires at rates that would overheat most comparable weapons within seconds. It does not overheat because the Ork crew aboard believes it will not overheat, and the collective psychic field surrounding the vehicle makes that belief architecturally load-bearing. Above all of this sits the Stompa, and beyond the Stompa, the Great Gargants and Mega Gargants that represent the outer boundary of what Ork technology can achieve. The sheer scale of these machines, the fact that they are built by a species with no formal engineering tradition, no standardized manufacturing, no supply chains, no quality control, and the further fact that they are effective, genuinely capable of challenging the most powerful war engines that any other faction in the setting can produce, is the concentrated distillation of everything that makes the Orks extraordinary. They should not be able to do this. The physics of it should not work. And then they build a walking fortress the size of a city block from scrap metal and fervent belief, and it walks out onto the battlefield, and the physics of it works anyway, and no one outside the Ork race can entirely explain why. Section 9. The greatest warlords in history. Legends of Ork power. Every faction in Warhammer 40,000 has its legendary figures. The Space Marines have Primarchs. The Eldari have ancient Farseers. The Imperium has Saints. The Chaos Powers have demon princes and fallen champions who have earned terrible immortality. The Orks have war bosses, and the greatest of them stand alongside any figure in the setting for sheer impact on galactic history. Let's begin with the most powerful Ork who may have ever lived. The being known to Imperial records only as the Beast was not a single warlord. This was not understood by the Imperium until much later, when the full scope of what they were dealing with finally became clear. The Beast was six prime Orks. Beings who had grown to such astronomical size and power that they represented something the Ork race had never previously produced, at least not in recorded history. Each of them commanded a separate Legion of Greenskins, a term that suggests an organizational structure so far beyond normal Ork social patterns that the Adeptus Mechanicus, when they eventually reconstructed the chain of events, concluded that the War of the Beast represented a genuine evolutionary event for the Ork species. These prime Orks were large enough that when Imperial forces first encountered the primary one on Ullanor, they initially mistook him for a statue. He was not a statue. When he moved, the realization of his scale, he was described in transmission records as being the size of a hab block, his mouth full of tusks the size of tree trunks, caused immediate tactical reassessment among the Imperial forces in the vicinity. He spoke fluent, perfect High Gothic. Not the crude, heavily accented version that blood axes sometimes achieve through deliberate study, but genuine, precise, elevated High Gothic, as though he had spent years mastering it. The intelligence this implied was deeply alarming. This was not an Ork who had simply grown very large and very strong. This was an Ork who had achieved a level of mental development that the Adeptus Mechanicus theorized might represent a latent stage of Ork evolution. One that only triggered when the combined power of a truly massive gathered force pushed individual Orks past a certain threshold. The Beast was embittered, according to what information the Imperium was eventually able to piece together, by the humiliation that the Ork race had suffered during the Ullanor Crusade, when Horus of the Luna Wolves had defeated a massive Ork force and earned his title of War Master. The Beast remembered that humiliation across the centuries. He planned, he gathered, and in the year 544 of the 32nd millennium, he moved. The War of the Beast, also known as the Great War of the Beast, began as a series of escalating attacks across Imperial space that initially seemed like an unusually large but not unprecedented Ork campaign. It became the largest war fought by the Imperium of Man since the Horus Heresy. Entire sectors fell. Ork forces appeared simultaneously on multiple fronts with a coordination that no Ork army had ever achieved before. The Beast had not merely assembled a horde, he had organized a military operation of strategic sophistication that matched anything the Imperium's own generals could produce. Attack moons, vast planetoid-scaled weapons platforms that the Orks had somehow engineered, materialized in orbit around Imperial worlds and destroyed their defenses before the ground assault began. The Imperial Fists, one of the most storied Space Marine chapters in existence, were nearly annihilated during the opening moves of the conflict, their fleet was destroyed. Their chapter master was killed. The chapter was reduced to a handful of survivors and had to invoke the Last Wall Protocol, calling upon all the Imperial Fist's successor chapters to gather as one force. The chapter that had built the walls of the Imperial Palace was brought to the brink of extinction. The war lasted for years. It consumed vast military resources. It required increasingly desperate measures, including the deployment of every Officio Assassinorum temple simultaneously at one point, and eventually required the personal intervention of multiple Primarchs, including Vulcan of the Salamanders, who led the final assault on the beast's throne world of Ulanor. The victory, when it came, was narrow, costly, and deeply scarring for the Imperium. It ended the time of rebirth, the period of relative peace and prosperity that had followed the Horus Heresy, and ushered in a darker era. The Orks did not disappear after the beast fell. They never do. The Great Horde dispersed as massive Ork forces inevitably do when the central figure holding them together is gone. But the worlds that had been touched by the campaign were seeded with spores, and the Imperium spent the next several centuries dealing with secondary and tertiary Ork outbreaks across the regions where the Great Army had marched. Now, 1,000 years into the 41st millennium, there is a figure who some scholars are beginning to compare to the beast. His name is Khazgakul Mag Uruk Thraka, and he is everything his name implies. Khazgakul's origin is almost deliberately humble, given the scale of what followed. He was a Goth Ork boy on the planet Urk, fighting in someone else's warband during a period when Space Marines raided the planet to disrupt Ork military buildup. During this raid, Khazgakul took a bolter round to the head. This is the kind of wound that ends careers, and in most cases lives. In Khazgakul's case, it ended a chapter and opened a much larger one. The pain boy who found him was Mad Doc Grotznik, and Grotznik's particular genius, or particular madness, depending on your perspective, expressed itself in rebuilding Khazgakul's shattered skull from solid adamantium. The surgery was extensive, the recovery was brutal, and what emerged from it was not quite the same Ork who had gone in. The pressure on his brain, or the changes to his neural architecture, or simply the shock of the experience, the exact mechanism is unclear and possibly irrelevant, produced something new. Khazgakul began receiving visions. Not the ordinary kind of Ork dream, not even the kind of communication that weird boys experience as a professional matter. These were direct, specific, detailed visions, and they told him that he was the chosen champion of Gork and Mork, and that the galaxy should prepare to hear his name. Within 6 years, he was a war boss. Within 7 years, his home planet's sun was dying, a coincidence that Khazgakul interpreted as a divine sign to move on to larger things. A space hulk appeared in orbit, offering a means of escape and transport. Khazgakul united his world's Ork population under his banner through a combination of personal victory in combat and the quietly terrifying authority of someone who genuinely believes he speaks for gods. The Hulk drifted through the warp, its systems failing repeatedly, its passengers fighting off continuous demon attacks, and emerged in the Armageddon system. The second war for Armageddon was, by the standards of what Khazgakul would later achieve, almost restrained. He hit Armageddon hard, broke a significant portion of its defenses, killed an enormous number of Imperial soldiers, and was eventually rebuffed through the efforts of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, a figure who would become Khazgakul's most cherished enemy, the one opponent he genuinely respected. The defeat, and it was a defeat in tactical terms, seems to have interested Khazgakul more than it frustrated him. He had found the kind of fight that an Ork of his quality deserved. 57 years later, a period Khazgakul spent gathering strength, expanding his influence, and presumably having very specific visions about what came next, he returned to Armageddon. The third war for Armageddon was significantly larger than the second. He conquered half the planet in the opening moves. The fighting ground down into a stalemate, as Armageddon's defenders were numerous and determined, and Yarrick was still among them. Khazgakul, apparently concluding that Armageddon was no longer the most interesting thing available to him, left. He left the war to his knobs to sort out. He had bigger plans. He was beheaded by Ragnar Blackmane of the Space Wolves during a subsequent engagement. This would have ended the career of most individuals. Grotznik rebuilt him. He now has a larger, more powerful body. He continues to operate. Khazgakul is currently leading what he calls the Great War, a campaign so vast that Imperial intelligence is receiving credible reports of him being simultaneously present in multiple locations across the galaxy, which in normal circumstances would be impossible, and in the context of Gaz-Gakul, has been determined to simply be what is actually happening. He commands a fleet that at last accurate count numbered over 5 million ships. The Death Watch, the Space Marine chapter specifically created to counter alien threats, was founded originally to fight the Beast. They are now dealing with someone who some members of their organization are beginning to quietly acknowledge may have the same scale of ambition and a more sophisticated method. Beyond Gaz-Gakul, Ork history is populated with warlords who each represent a different dimension of what the Ork race can produce when properly motivated. Captain Badruk is the most famous Ork freebooter, a pirate captain who commands his own fleet independent of any clan structure, hiring his forces out to the highest bidder and occasionally simply taking everything that was not nailed down, including things that were nailed down but which he thought he could denail. He represents the entrepreneurial edge of Ork culture, the Orks who fall outside the normal clan structure and carve out their own niches through personal competence and spectacular unpredictability. What makes Badruk particularly interesting from a lore perspective is that he represents a class of Ork that other factions have occasionally attempted to leverage, a mercenary who, in theory, will work for whoever pays. In practice, working with Captain Badruk means accepting that your contract terms are interpreted very liberally, that payment upon completion frequently becomes payment was the journey and the enemies we made along the way, and that the phrase collateral damage covers a significantly wider range of outcomes than you anticipated when you initially opened negotiations. But he shows up, and he fights, and he is remarkably effective, which is why despite his reputation, he continues to find clients. Boss Snickrot leads the Red Skull Commandos, a force of Blood Axe stealth specialists whose exploits on Armageddon include the systematic elimination of Imperial fortifications through infiltration and ambush conducted with a precision that would embarrass Astartes scout companies. He is the argument that Orks can do tactical intelligence operations when they choose to, and he chooses to with results that have given multiple Imperial commanders serious cause to reconsider their assumptions about what a green-skinned foe is capable of. Snickrot is one of the most unnerving Ork figures in the lore precisely because he is not what anyone expects an Ork to be: quiet, patient, invisible, deadly in ways that have nothing to do with volume or forward momentum. He is the Ork who taught the Imperium that silence, coming from a direction where you expected Ork noise, is significantly more dangerous than the noise itself. Wazdaka Gutsmek is the greatest speed freak to ever live, a rider whose skills on his bike, the bike of the apocalypse, have elevated cult of speed philosophy from cultural preference to something approaching metaphysics. He exists at the intersection of the fastest possible Ork vehicle and the most powerful belief in speed that any single Ork consciousness has ever generated. And the combination is an object that the laws of physics allow in the vicinity of an Ork psychic field, which is to say, one that goes impossibly, absurdly, delightfully fast. Then there are the war bosses whose names are remembered not because they were the largest or the most connected to the divine, but because they simply won. Gruckface Rippa led a campaign called the Red Wog that shook multiple sectors, fighting against space wolves and other Imperial forces with a ferocity that his size, enormous even by war boss standards, made terrifyingly concrete. The campaign demonstrated that even in the post-Beast era, before Gaz-Gakul had fully consolidated his position as the supreme war boss of his age, the Ork race continued to produce leaders capable of mobilizing forces large enough to challenge entire sectors. The pattern these figures collectively represent is important. They are not all the same. They are not all doing the same thing, fighting the same way, for the same reasons. Badruk and Snickrot and Wazdaka and Gaz-Gakul and Gruk are as different from each other as any collection of human military leaders across history. They embody different aspects of what the Ork genome can express at its upper limit. The old ones built a species with genuine range, a species capable of producing warlords of almost any strategic archetype, from the pure melee engine to the cunning tactician to the speed-obsessed cavalry commander to the mercenary pragmatist. Whatever situation demands, somewhere in the Ork race, there is a figure who was designed to rise to that occasion. Section 10. The Orks Through History. From the Great Crusade to the present day, to properly appreciate the scale of the Ork threat in the 41st millennium, it helps to trace the thread of Ork history across the broader timeline of the 40,000 universe, because the pattern that emerges is one of consistent, escalating presence that the Imperium has repeatedly failed to address adequately. During the Great Crusade, the era when the Primarchs were reunited with the Emperor of Mankind, and the Imperium was being built through systematic military expansion across the galaxy, the Orks represented one of the primary opponents of the crusading forces. Entire systems that the crusading armies reached were already Ork-held, or contested, or recovering from recent Ork incursions. The size of the Ork presence in the galaxy at this period was significant enough that several Primarchs built their reputations partly or substantially on victories against greenskin forces. Jog-Hadi Khan of the White Scars fought the Orks with a particular fury that made his name feared across the greenskin populations of multiple sectors. Leman Russ and the Space Wolves had their share of Ork engagements. Ferrus Manus, before his fall at Istvan, led campaigns against Ork-held Forge Worlds, where the greenskins had somehow, nobody is entirely sure how, managed to reverse engineer enough of the local industrial capacity to begin producing war materiel at scale. But the most significant engagement of this era was the Ulanor Crusade, led personally by the War Master Horus, before his fall, when he was still the Emperor's most trusted son. The Ulanor campaign targeted the largest Ork empire then known to exist, a gathering of greenskins so massive that it threatened to become the kind of unified force that Ork biology makes possible at extreme scale. Horus shattered this empire through a campaign of immense military sophistication and personal martial excellence. The victory was celebrated across the Imperium, and Horus was elevated to War Master. It is worth pausing on what this tells us about the Orks in this period. Defeating the Ulanor Orks required a dedicated campaign by some of the greatest military minds the species has ever produced, led personally by the being who was at that moment probably the most powerful individual space marine in existence, against an opponent that had not yet reached its maximum theoretical scale. The victory was real and meaningful, but the message embedded in its difficulty was one the Imperium chose not to hear as clearly as it should have. After the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart, the Orks entered a new phase. The military forces that had been holding Ork pressures at bay across dozens of sectors were suddenly redirected, destroyed, or compromised. The borders that had been maintained thinned. The suppressive campaigns that had kept Ork populations from building to critical mass in certain regions were suspended. The Orks, as they always do, took advantage of the available space. Then came the War of the Beast, discussed in the previous section, which nearly ended the Imperium entirely and represents the high-water mark of organized Ork power in all of recorded history. The fact that the Imperium survived it is a genuine historical close call. The aftermath of the War of the Beast deserves specific attention because it illustrates something important about how the Ork threat functions over time. The military victory, the killing of the Prime Orks, the breaking of their unified command structure, immediately began to look less complete than it appeared. The forces of the Beast dispersed rather than being destroyed. Ork warbands that had been operating under the coordinated direction of the Beast simply reverted to their natural state of independent action, which meant that the 1,000 different fronts the Imperium had been fighting simultaneously continued to require active military engagement. There was no peace dividend after the War of the Beast. There was only a slightly less organized version of the same war, which continued without interruption. The millennium that followed the War of the Beast saw the Ork threat managed, never solved. Individual Ork empires rose and fell. Campaigns were fought, won, lost, stalemated. The Ork presence across the galaxy fluctuated in intensity, but never in direction. It was always there, always a source of ongoing conflict, always a background radiation of violence that the Imperium had to spend resources containing. The Second and Third Wars for Armageddon represent the most detailed examination of what a significant Ork campaign looks like from the inside, at the organizational and tactical level. These wars have been extensively documented through the efforts of multiple Imperial historians and have informed much of the current strategic doctrine for dealing with greenskin incursions. The lessons are not encouraging. What the Armageddon Wars demonstrated, more clearly than perhaps any previous conflict, is that Ork forces can adapt to defensive situations in ways that the Imperium's standard playbook does not adequately account for. They can establish fortified positions. They can maintain siege operations over extended periods. They can coordinate across wide areas when led by a war boss whose psychic influence is strong enough to hold the force together. They can, as Gazgakul proved, develop and execute technological solutions to tactical problems that should have been insurmountable, including the Mega Teleshaka device that teleported his entire fleet across the system in a single move, bypassing the entire Imperial defensive network that had been built to prevent exactly that kind of flanking operation. The jungle fights of Armageddon's equatorial regions produced something particularly noteworthy: the development of Ork commandos under boss Snikrot into a genuine special operations force, operating behind Imperial lines for extended periods, conducting sabotage and assassination with a level of tactical discipline that no Ork force was supposed to be capable of. Imperial commanders who planned their defenses around the assumption that Ork attacks would be frontal and obvious found themselves dealing with an enemy who was already inside their perimeter, had been for weeks, and who had spent that time identifying and quietly eliminating the key components of the defensive structure. Fortresses that had seemed impregnable went silent overnight. Patrol teams stopped reporting in. Supply convoys vanished between checkpoints. By the time anyone understood what was happening, there was a commando unit at the throat of the local command structure, and an Ork warband arriving through the gap they had opened. The wars on Armageddon are also notable for what they reveal about the psychological impact of Ork opponents on human forces. Commissar Yarrick, the legendary defender of Armageddon, who became Gazgkul's greatest enemy and his most cherished opponent, represents something remarkable in the 40,000 universe. A baseline human, not a space marine, not a psyker, not an enhanced or augmented super soldier, who through sheer force of will and tactical genius earned the genuine respect of the Orks he faced. There is a story, probably true, that the Orks began to believe that Yarrick could kill them with his eye after he had his eye removed and replaced with a bionic one. He learned of this belief, and he had the Ork-killing bionic eye built for exactly that reason. The man understood Ork psychology well enough to weaponize their own beliefs against them. Gazgakul, who could have killed Yarrick on at least 2 occasions, released him instead, reportedly because Yarrick was simply too good an opponent to waste. Section 11. The Orks in the 41st Millennium, the Eternal Green Tide. In the current era of the 41st Millennium, particularly after the opening of the Great Rift, the massive tear in reality that now splits the galaxy from one end to the other, the Orks are experiencing something that has no precedent in recent history, and that has the Imperium's strategic planners in a state of controlled panic that they are working very hard not to let become uncontrolled panic. The Orks are excited. This sounds almost comedic when stated plainly, but the implications are profoundly serious. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the wound in space itself that Chaos tore open when the demon Primarch Magnus the Red attacked Fenris, has not frightened the Orks. It has not caused them to retreat or seek safety or pause their campaigns out of caution. It has thrilled them. An enormous amount of chaos, an enormous amount of violence, an enormous number of wars breaking out simultaneously across the galaxy. From an Ork perspective, this is the best possible news. The great mobilization that the Orks always have building behind the dam of their own internal conflicts is finding outlets everywhere it looks. It is worth elaborating on just how broadly the Ork presence extends in the current period. There is not a single sector of Imperial space that does not face some level of Ork activity, from the relative nuisance of small raiding parties pushing against border worlds to full-scale invasions that require major military responses. The sheer geographic breadth of the Ork presence means that, even in the absence of a unified command structure, the Imperium is never able to reduce its anti-Ork military commitment below a certain threshold. There are always fires to fight, there are always raids to repel, and each of those small skirmishes, each raid that gets beaten back, each local war boss who gathers a few thousand boys and throws them at the nearest Imperial system, every single one of those events seeds new spores in new places and grows the next generation of the problem. Gazgakul's Great War continues to gather momentum, though its exact disposition is extremely difficult to track, because reports of his presence across multiple systems simultaneously are consistent enough to have moved from impossible intelligence error to, this is apparently what is happening. The theory that resonates most strongly among inquisitorial scholars is that Gazghakul's psychic connection to Gork and Mork, mediated through his adamantium skull and the decades of visions he has received, has reached a level of intensity that allows his consciousness to manifest across multiple physical bodies simultaneously. That he is, in the terminology the Inquisition uses very carefully and only in extremely classified documents, approaching something like what the beast was. Maybe approaching it from a different direction, with more tactical sophistication and less raw brute force, but approaching it. The Octarius sector continues its impossible war. The Tyranid hive fleet that entered that sector, effectively trading casualties with one of the largest Ork concentrations in the galaxy, has produced something that neither faction expected, a feedback loop of biological escalation. Tyranids adapt to challenges. Orks grow stronger when they fight. The forces engaging each other in the Octarius War are, by current estimates, producing combat veterans of both species who are significantly more powerful than any specimens previously recorded, because each side's natural response to the opposition is making both of them better. The Imperium, observing this from a safe distance and praying that neither side wins too quickly, is aware that whatever comes out of Octarius when one side finally prevails will be a significantly improved version of whichever species survives. What this means practically is that the Octarius sector is acting as an accelerated evolution chamber for two of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The Tyranids will emerge from it having adapted specifically to counter Ork biology and Ork fighting techniques. They will carry genetic templates for defeating greenskins embedded in their swarm consciousness. The Orks will emerge from it having grown in response to the most biologically sophisticated opponent they have ever faced. Harder shelled, faster growing, more aggressive, and with whatever biological changes result from extended combats against Tyranid acid and neural parasites. Neither outcome is one the Imperium wants to see arrive on its doorstep. The Beast Snaga movement represents a fascinating new development in Ork culture. Orks who have developed a specific focus on hunting the largest possible prey, who ride massive squig beasts into battle, who have adopted a quasi-shamanic relationship with their mounts and with the primal natural world. They are, in their way, the Orks returning to something ancient in their nature, the biological legacy of the Old One's creation, the pure expression of designed for combat purpose, before even the layer of Ork technology. Their warboys receive visions that their community treats as genuine prophecy. Their relationship with their beasts is genuinely symbiotic rather than merely instrumental. And their effectiveness against the largest and most armored targets on any battlefield, the monsters, the vehicles, the machines of war, is disproportionate to their numbers in ways that suggest the Old One's design is still fully operative. The Vigilus conflict gave the galaxy its first extended look at Gazghkul in the context of the Great Rift era, and what it revealed was not encouraging. He deployed against a world that was already under pressure from multiple directions, adding an Ork dimension to a conflict that already involved chaos incursions. The Ork forces on Vigilus included a big mech named Tank Scrappa, who constructed a mega-gargant called Da Great Gargant Gorkzilla, a name that tells you everything about Ork naming conventions and nothing useful about defensive options for the planetary garrison. The scale of violence that the Ork component of the Vigilus campaign introduced redefined the logistical problem for the defenders, who had not previously anticipated having to deal with a walking fortress the size of a small city on top of everything else they were already dealing with. On the tabletop, in the current era of Warhammer 40,000, the Orks continue to reward the kind of player who approaches them not as a straightforward fight-everything army, but as a faction with genuine strategic depth hiding behind the surface comedy. The Speed Freaks detachment, built around the Cult of Speed's love of fast vehicles and aggressive movement, produces some of the most mobile and threatening lists in the game. The Big Wog approach, combining the strengths of both Gork-focused combat power and Mork-focused tactical flexibility, creates armies that can genuinely respond to a variety of situations. And simple, overwhelming Goth-style mob tactics remain a genuinely effective approach against many armies, because there is still something deeply uncomfortable about having 100 Ork boys descend on your position while your opponent rolls dice with serene confidence. The sheer volume of attacks that a properly built orc list can generate in melee is something that experienced players respect, and inexperienced players, playing against orcs for the first time, discover too late. The orcs are also one of the most rewarding hobby experiences in the entire range, which is worth mentioning because it connects directly to why people who invest time in them tend to develop the deepest appreciation for them. Every orc model is an invitation to customize. The lore explicitly supports the idea that no two orcs are exactly alike, that every piece of equipment has been individually modified by someone with strong opinions and no formal training, that every vehicle represents the specific fever dream of a particular mech boy at a particular moment. This means that building an orc army is genuinely creative in a way that other armies are not. You can kit bash, you can scratch build, you can take components from completely unrelated kits and bolt them together and have the result be not only visually acceptable, but actually lore accurate, because the lore says that is exactly what an orc would do. The orc range is the setting's built-in permission slip for creative madness, and the people who take full advantage of it produce some of the most spectacular armies the hobby has ever seen. Section 12. Why orcs are the most dangerous force in the galaxy. We have covered a great deal of ground in this exploration. The ancient origins, the remarkable biology, the self-sustaining ecosystem, the 6 great clans and their distinct cultures, the Odd Boys specialists, the psychic green tide, the war machines, the legendary warlords, the history across the millennia. It is time to pull all of this together and address the central thesis that we began with. Why the dismissal of the orcs as a comedy faction is not just factually wrong, but strategically dangerous. The orcs cannot be exterminated. This is not hyperbole or fan enthusiasm. This is the actual, considered assessment of the Imperium's xenological experts. A planet that has hosted a significant orc presence is permanently compromised. The spores are in the soil, in the water, in the roots of plants, and the crevices of rock. Short of sterilizing the entire surface down to the bedrock, an act that is not casually available to most military forces, those spores will wait. They have waited longer than recorded human history before. They will wait longer. Orc civilizations have collapsed, been defeated, been scattered, and been reborn from those dormant spores on worlds where no orc had stood for centuries. You cannot win by killing, you can only delay. The orcs are more numerous than any other intelligent species in the galaxy. The Imperium, with its trillions of individual humans spread across countless worlds, is the largest human civilization ever to exist. The orcs collectively outnumber it. They do this without centralized administration, without logistics, without a single governing body, without schools, without any of the infrastructure that human civilization requires to maintain population. They do this because every orc that has ever lived has been seeding the environment around it with spores, and those spores have been germinating, and those populations have been growing, and those grown populations have been fighting and spreading further for hundreds of millions of years. The orcs are getting stronger. This is perhaps the most disquieting aspect of orc nature from a long-term strategic perspective. The orcs grow more powerful the more they fight. The current state of the 41st millennium, with its perpetual multi-front wars, its opening of the Great Rift, its constant violence and escalating conflicts across every sector, is essentially an optimal environment for orc development. More fights means larger war bosses. Larger war bosses attract more orcs. More orcs means larger psychic fields. Larger psychic fields means stronger technology. The feedback loop runs in exactly the wrong direction for every other species in the galaxy. The orcs, alone among the major powers of the 40K universe, have nothing to fear from the long game. The Chaos powers are ancient and powerful, but they depend on the corruption of other species for their material influence. The Tyranids are an existential threat, but they consume and move on. The Necrons are eternal, but they are few in relative terms, and their interests are limited in scope. Humanity is resilient, but it is aging, degrading, losing knowledge, watching its greatest institutions calcify. The Aeldari are in long decline, their numbers shrinking, their culture increasingly defensive. The Tau are young and vital, but still learning the galaxy's full dimensions. The orcs have been here since before all of them, in one form or another. They will be here after all of them, in one form or another. They do not experience resource depletion, institutional decay, cultural fatigue, or long-term strategic pessimism. They experience war, which they love, and the opportunity for more war, which they love even more. Every catastrophe that afflicts the other factions is, from an Ork perspective, an opportunity. The single thing that prevents the Orks from simply overrunning everything else in the galaxy right now, the single limiting factor that stands between the current situation and the scenario every other faction quietly dreads, is the Orks themselves. They fight each other. They splinter into 1,000 warbands with 1,000 different priorities. They follow their own war bosses in different directions. The psychic tide that would be unstoppable if unified disperses into 1,000 smaller currents, each pushing against the others. Gazgakul understands this. The Beast understood this. The moments in history when the Orks have come closest to winning everything have been the moments when a single figure managed to channel enough of that scattered energy into a unified direction. The Ork race is a pressure vessel, and the warlords who matter most are the ones who understand how to direct the pressure. Those who simply ride it, like many war bosses who gather large forces but cannot hold them together long enough for the force to achieve its full potential, ultimately disperse back into the noise. Those who direct it, who possess the combination of personal power, psychic influence, tactical vision, and sheer overwhelming presence that makes other Orks follow them the way iron filings follow a magnet. Those are the ones that change history. The fact that the galaxy has produced two of them, the Beast and Gazgakul, and that the second appears to be growing towards something that at least partially resembles the scale of the first, should give every student of this setting pause. Now, think about what this actually means in practical terms. Every other faction in the 40,000 universe is fighting a war of attrition that they know they cannot ultimately win indefinitely. The Imperium is running out of certain key technologies it cannot reproduce. The Aeldari are running out of people. The Tau have not yet encountered the full scope of what the galaxy can throw at them. The Necrons are running out of time before the Destroyer Curse claims more of them. Chaos can never truly win, because its nature prevents the peace that would represent genuine victory. The Orks cannot run out of people. They cannot run out of weapons because they make new ones from whatever is nearby. They cannot run out of food because they grow it, and hunt it, and absorb sunlight. They cannot run out of morale because they genuinely enjoy this. They cannot be diplomatically isolated or economically sanctioned or ideologically subverted. The standard tools of strategic competition simply do not apply to a species whose entire existence is optimized for one thing, and for whom that one thing is something the current state of the galaxy is producing in abundance. There is something almost philosophical about the Orks when you look at them through this lens. In a universe defined by grimdark cynicism, by the grinding weight of a civilization that endures but cannot truly flourish, by the constant horror of a galaxy at war, the Orks are perhaps the only species that genuinely finds this environment agreeable. They are not suffering under the conditions of the 41st millennium. They are thriving. The perpetual war that is slowly killing everyone else is, for them, paradise. This is either darkly funny or genuinely terrifying, depending on which side of it you are standing on. For the Imperial citizens living under constant threat of a green tide emerging from their planet's wilderness, it is the latter. For someone observing the larger picture of the setting, the way each faction represents a different philosophical response to the question of what existence means in this universe. The Orks represent something unexpected. They represent joy, completely misaligned with every other value in the setting, expressed entirely through violence, utterly alien to anything a human would recognize as happiness, but genuine. The Orks are having the time of their lives. They always have been. The Orks are not the joke army. They are the oldest ongoing war in the galaxy, fought by the most numerous species in the galaxy, whose numbers keep growing, whose warriors keep getting stronger, whose technology works on principles that circumvent the normal rules of what is possible, and whose greatest leaders have twice in recorded history come close to ending the Imperium of Man entirely. They paint their vehicles red because they believe it makes them go faster. It does. That is the Orks. That is what everyone is underestimating. And in the grim darkness of the far future, underestimating the Orks is precisely the kind of mistake that empties planets. There is also one final thing worth saying. something that sits outside pure military analysis and into the realm of why the Orks resonate so deeply with people who really dig into this setting. They are, in their way, the most honest faction. The Space Marines fight for an emperor they cannot see, under doctrines they cannot fully question, in service of a civilization that barely acknowledges them as individuals. The Chaos Forces fight for gods who will eventually consume them. The Necrons fight to reclaim a purpose that was stolen from them by their own choices. The Eldari fight to preserve a culture already in its twilight. Every other faction in this universe carries something tragic with it. Some weight, some compromise, some fundamental sadness woven into their existence. The Orks fight because they want to, because it is what they are. Because every morning an Ork wakes up in the universe that was built for them, by beings who understood war better than anyone, and decided that what war needed most was a species that would always, absolutely, genuinely love it, and that species loves it still. There is something almost admirable in that, even if you are on the receiving end of it. Especially if you are on the receiving end of it. The Orks are ancient. They are everywhere. They are growing stronger with every conflict this galaxy produces. And this galaxy produces nothing but conflict. They are not the punchline of the 40,000 universe. They are its oldest, loudest, most stubborn question. What happens when the ultimate weapon outlives the war it was made for? And the answer to that question turns out to be that it finds another war, and then another, and then another, and keeps finding them across hundreds of millions of years because that is what it was built to do. And nothing in the galaxy has yet found a way to make it stop. The Orks endure. They always have. They always will. And somewhere out in the dark, a war boss is growing larger. He is gathering more boys to his banner. He is receiving visions of red fire and green thunder. He is building something in a workshop somewhere, something that no mech boy has ever built before, something that should not work and definitely will. And his eyes are moving across the stars, the way that a hungry thing moves across a map. He is not worried about you. Maybe you should worry about him. The galaxy has no shortage of ancient threats and rising powers and existential dangers that keep Imperial strategists awake through long, cold nights in the void. Chaos tears at reality from within. Tyranids consume from without. Necrons rise from their tombs with the patience of things that have been waiting 60 million years and are prepared to wait 60 million more. But the Orks, the loud, green, allegedly simple Orks, are the threat that has been there through all of it. The background, the constant, the faction that everyone is dealing with always, simultaneously, without end, because they spread and they grow and they fight and they die and they leave spores and the cycle begins again. Every world that beats back the green tide is fighting a holding action. Every campaign that clears an Ork infestation is delaying the next one. The war against the Orks is not a war you win. It is a condition of existence in this universe, as natural and inevitable as gravity. If you made it this far, thank you genuinely for spending this time exploring one of the most fascinating factions in all of science fiction with me. The Orks reward the kind of attention that most people never give them, and I hope today's video has given you a new way of seeing what the green tide actually is, not just on the tabletop, but in the broader mythology of the 40K universe. If you found this valuable, please hit the subscribe button. Drop a comment below. I want to know which aspect of Ork lore surprised you most today. Was it the psychic belief system? The war of the beast? The fact that red ones literally go faster? Tell me. I read every comment and it genuinely shapes what content comes next. There is a lot more of the 40K universe to explore together. The stories are vast, the lore runs deep, and we have barely scratched the surface of what lives in the darkness between the stars. Until next time, stay curious, stay calm, and remember, the Orks are out there. They always are.